Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes, going live at 4 o'clock on the 19th of March 2021. It's very nice to see you and to have your company. Thank you for joining me. We are continuing with our book by Norman Collins, London Belongs to Me. My chair seems to be a little on the high side. There we go. Let's say a few hellos to people who've arrived to enjoy today's reading. Hello to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Billabong O'Neill, Justine Jones, Dave Ivad, Philip and Mary, Jen Coley, Zom Coco, Ed Loud. Good afternoon. Hello, my phone is going. Ed Loud says, have got to get my dad from hospital, finally. So I won't be along. We'll listen to the rest later, as it's always too good to miss. Ah, bless you. And, well, it's all down to Norman Collins, really. Anne H., hello all. No sound. That's very strange. You should be getting sound. Have you got... Oh, it was you. Good. You put me in a panic. You put me in a panic. I thought for a moment there was no sound. Hello all from sunny Eastbourne. Hello, Sensible Paul. And John F., good afternoon to you. Fantastic. Right then, ladies and gentlemen. Where were we? Oh yes, Doris had brought Doreen home to meet Mr. and Mrs. Josser. Mrs. Josser had gone through the pretense that she wasn't doing anything special to impress this woman, except that she tidied everything away that was a bit messy and put on her best frock, much to the chagrin of Mr. Josser, who was very much perplexed by the whole thing. So that's pretty much where we got to. And I think they were eating, weren't they? And I'm just trying to remember that I left them there because, bring in the jelly, that's right. So they were going to bring in the jelly. It's in the kitchen with the pineapple. Don't forget the cream, if you remember, was where we were. Tool Podge Rog has arrived. Nice to see you. Rog, so there we go, yes. To Doris's astonishment, Mrs. Josser didn't move. She just sat there, ordering her about, and there was nothing that can be done about it, not until later at least. Doris gathered the plates together. She positively snatched Mrs. Josser's from in front of her and piled them on a tray. As she went out of the room, she heard Mrs. Josser talking confidently to Doreen. I don't know what I should do without Doris, she was saying. She helps me so much in the house. I could never get along without her. It was a cold night, and the fruit jelly and pineapple had an unusually chilling look about them. Even the pineapple seemed sub-Arctic rather than tropical. The little cubes slid icily onto the plates as Mrs. Josser spooned them out. Doreen begged Mrs. Josser to give her only the teeniest little bit. Doris wasn't eating properly either. Some sixth sense told her that Mrs. Josser was about to get on to the subject of the flat, and she was right. Doris was telling me all about this scheme of yours, she said, suddenly, turning to Doreen, and I don't... She got no further, however, because there was someone at the door. Whoever it was knocked twice, like a postman. Postman never knocks twice, apparently, according to a film. Sorry about that, just needed a slurp of coffee. There's someone there, Mr. Josser said, helpfully. Oh, unhelpfully, even. See who it is, dear, Mrs. Josser said, still without rising. She turned to Doreen. We can talk about this flat idea later, she said. I want you to hear my side. When Mr. Josser opened the door, he was quite surprised to see Percy, and a very much embarrassed Percy. He'd been holding himself back for at least half an hour until he was perfectly sure that the Jossers would have finished supper, and now Here he was at 9:15, gate crashing right in the middle of it. Because it had been Doris, whom he was going downstairs to see, he had taken pains with himself. He had thrust a new crêpe de chine handkerchief into his breast pocket, and he was wearing his yellow shoes, a pair that was so tight they wouldn't do up properly. He hadn't gone so far as to change his suit as well. And until you noticed his hair, it seemed a rather stained and oily figure that was standing there. But the hair was immaculate. He'd just rubbed in a handful of brillatine into it, and he came forward into the room smelling like a conservatory. Halfway across, however, he stopped dead. He had caught sight of Doreen. She was resting her chin on her hands and staring at him. He became aware of the dark, lashed eyes, a fringe of gleaming hair, and a pair of jangling jade earrings. "She's okay. She knows her way about," he thought hurriedly. It was the first time, as far as Doris could remember, that Percy had come down to see them this way. She was puzzled, but she didn't want to seem put out by it. "Oh, this is Mr. Boone," she said. "You haven't met my friend, Miss Smythe." "How d'ye do?" said Percy, stretching across the table to shake hands with her. "How d'ye do?" Doreen replied, politely. After that there was a pause. Percy went awkward. He just stood there waving his hands together. "Did you come down for something?" Mrs. Josser asked unencouragingly. I wanted to know if Doris was doing anything. Next Saturday, I mean. I thought we might have gone to the Palais," he replied. And then, because it sounded a bit flat and not in the way a man of the world ought to talk, he added, "Just the usual hop, you know, nothing special." "Oh, I can't. Thank you very much," Doris answered promptly. "I'm going out with Doreen. It's all fixed up, isn't it, Doreen?" Doreen was quick on the uptake on that sort of thing. She understood at once. "It's such a pity," she said. "If only we'd known we could have put it off, but we can't now we've asked all those people." Percy stood there looking at his feet. "Well, I suppose I ought to be getting on then in that case," he said. "What's the hurry?" Mr. Josser asked. "Why don't you come in and sit down?" "Oh, thanks," said Percy. He sat down in Mr. Josser's chair and took out his cigarette case. "Mind if I light a fag?" he asked, but then he remembered his manners. "Anybody else have one?" he inquired. "We haven't finished yet," Mrs. Josser told him. But apparently Doreen didn't mind in the least not having finished. From the way she took the cigarette, it was apparent that it was the one thing that she'd been longing for. She left the 2 cubes of pineapple and the iceberg of jelly on the plate untouched and took a cigarette holder out of her bag, and then she sat there blowing out slow coils of smoke across the table. Mrs. Josser said nothing, but she made a note of it, both smoking at the table and using a cigarette holder. She had already made a note of the way that Mr. Josser had invited Percy in without consulting her. But Mr. Josser seemed unaware of having done anything wrong. He was talking to Percy in a familiar, friendly fashion, as though Percy had often spent the evening with them. "How's everything at the garage?" he asked. Before Percy could answer, Doreen had interrupted the conversation. She turned her back on Mrs. Josser, which was another thing that Mrs. Josser had made a note of, and suddenly became quite animated. "Oh, are you one of those marvellous people who know the insides of cars, valves and things?" she asked. "I think they're terribly clever. I'm quite sure I wouldn't know one end of an engine from another." "She's a bouncer. She's a lady. She's hot stuff. She's the only girl I know who uses a holder," Percy was thinking. But he didn't know how to answer. She talked too quickly for him. It was Mrs. Josser who answered for him. "It's not your job. That's why you don't know," she said. She herself could see absolutely nothing marvellous about the young Percy, and she didn't see any use in pretending that there was anything. Doreen turned to her just long enough to give offence again. "Oh, I don't know," she said. "I think it's absolutely wonderful being able to do those things with engines. Men are so much cleverer than women. Don't you think so, Mrs. Josser?" Mrs. Josser drew in her lips. It was obvious that she did not think so. "Will anyone have some cheese?" she asked. "Oh, I couldn't, thank you," Doreen answered. "I've eaten a gigantic meal." "Then I'll give Doris a hand with cleaning away," Mrs. Josser offered. Outside, in the kitchen, mother and daughter scarcely spoke. It was not until they were going back into the front room that Doris said anything. How long do you think Percy's going to stop?" she asked. "All night, if your father has anything to do with it," Mrs. Josser replied. "And all I want is a private word with that Doreen of yours before she goes." It was even worse than they had feared when they got back. They found that Mr. Josser had suggested rummy. Obstinately misreading the nature of Doreen's visit, he was trying to make things go with a swing. He was counting out little heaps of coloured tiddlywinks, saying humorously, £5.10 for Mrs. Smythe, the same amount for Mother, same again for Percy, a ditto for Doris, and what's left for me? No cheating, mind. That was too much for Mrs. Josser. She had no intention of sitting down to rummy with young Percy. "Where's your mother, Percy?" she asked. "Upstairs." Did you tell her you were stopping?" Percy shook his head. "Don't you think she might be lonely?" she said pointedly. A pleased, unself-conscious smile spread across Percy's face. "You mean bring her down? Oh, thanks ever so," he said. There was a rather strained silence when he had left, and Doris turned to Mrs. Josser. "Oh, Mum, why did you? She asked. "Me?" Mrs. Josser replied indignantly. "I didn't do anything. It was your father." "Never opened my mouth," Mr. Josser answered, still arranging the chips. "You asked her down yourself." "I didn't," Mrs. Josser said, emphatically. "Well, she's coming. That's the main thing," Mr. Josser replied. "We shall have a big party before we've finished." But Mrs. Boone evidently needed a bit of persuading. 5 minutes passed, and then 10, and there was still no sign of either her or her son. Finally, Mr. Josser insisted that they should begin without waiting for them. Mrs. Josser, however, seemed reluctant even to pick up her cards. It was not indeed until she'd actually got them in her hands and began studying them that she seemed to enter into the spirit of things. Then something happened. She adjusted her spectacles, frowned, made a little clicking noise of disapproval at the luck of what had been dealt, and began rearranging her cards into a fashionable fan-shaped pattern. In her youth, she had cut a pretty good figure at the whist table, and she knew how to hold her cards. But before the round had reached her, there was a knock at the door. Mr. Josser put down his cards and glanced at Doris. "That'll be them," said Mr. Josser. "Now I'll have to re-deal." But it wasn't Mrs. Boone. It was Mrs. Vizard. She was obviously agitated. And standing there in the dark passage with the light on her face, she seemed pale. Unnaturally pale. Almost like a spirit herself. Doreen sat watching her bewitched. She wondered how many more people were going to arrive. "Is your mother there?" Mrs. Vizard inquired. Mrs. Josser put down her cards and got up. "You wanted me, Mrs. Vizard?" she asked. She had a respect for Mrs. Vizard, and was even prepared to interrupt a game for her. After all, it wasn't every night that Mrs. Vizard paid them a visit. "I wanted a word with you. In private, Mrs. Vizard began in a mysterious whisper, and then stopped herself. She, too, had become aware of the strange young lady at the table who was staring at her. "Oh, I am sorry. I didn't know you had company," she said. Doris recognised this for another occasion when poise... Oh, sorry. Doris recognised this for another occasion when poise was called for. "Oh, Mrs. Vizard, this is my friend, Miss Smythe," she explained. Mrs. Vizard's hand seemed like cold ivy. It was shaking. Oh, it was like shaking hands with a dead duchess. Doreen felt a kind of icy chill rising up her spine at the contact. It quite upset her. But Mrs. Vizard could not bear to be waiting any longer to hear what Mrs. Josser could not bear to be Mrs. Josser could not bear to be kept waiting any longer to see what Mrs. Vizard had to tell her. "Come outside," she said in a whisper in the same mysterious hoarseness that Mrs. Vizard had used. "We'll talk out there." Doreen turned away and picked up her cards again. The game of rummy even, was beginning and breaking up again so frequently that she was losing count. And even now Mrs. Josser and Mrs. Vizard got no further than the door, for at that moment Percy was coming back in with his mother. He was rather self-conscious about being there at all, and so was Mrs. Boone. They sidled in rather than walked, and Mrs. Boone began thinking Mrs. Boone... Sorry, I'm not reading at all well tonight. And Mrs. Boone began thanking Mrs. Josser straight away. "It was very nice of you to ask me down, Mrs. Josser," she said. It can be a bit quiet, you know, just upstairs by yourself." Percy had warned her about Doreen, but the presence of Mrs. Vizard was an entire surprise. She realised now that the Jossers must be throwing a party. What she didn't realise, of course, was half the party was trying to get into the passage for a secret session. She led her way over to the fire, and the other two followed. Oh, I do hope I'm not breaking up your game," Mrs. Boone said apologetically. She had a way of regarding herself as the least important guest whenever she was... She had a way of regarding herself as the least important guest, whatever she was, and therefore kept on excusing herself. "Oh, it's quite all right," Mrs. Josser told her. "If you ladies want to talk, we'll make up a four with Percy. It might as well be whist as we're the right number." I thought Mrs. Josser wanted to go. Oh, Mr. Josser. Sorry, yes, I was going to say. Hang on, sorry about this. So Mrs. Boone has gone in. "Quite all right," Mr. Josser told her. "If you ladies want to talk, we'll make up a four with Percy. It might as well be whist, as we've got the right number." Doreen started and looked round for her. Except for Doris, she didn't seem to have any connection with the evening at all, and until Mr. Josser actually named it, she had never suspected anything quite so awful as whist. The very worst that she had feared was auction. Is auction another game, presumably? There was a distraction, however, a very effective distraction. She became aware that the three women behind her were talking earnestly in low whispers, and if there was one form of which the human voice carries better than any other, it is in a low whisper. Sitting up at the table, waiting for Mr. Josser to decide whether to throw away a two or come thumping in with a trump, she found herself in the middle of a shadowy conversation that fascinated her. "Nowhere else to go if we don't turn her out," Mrs. Josser was saying. "Poor old thing, I feel quite sorry for her." That was Mrs. Boone's voice. "But no," Doreen recognised Mrs. Vizard's voice. "After this. She can't come back for one night to pack her things, but after that... Oh, she can come back one night to pack her things, but after that, she goes." Obviously talking about Connie, I think. It was Mr. Josser who interrupted Doreen's eavesdropping. In the middle of the fourth round, he suddenly forgot what trumps were and he had to ask. And then, when they told him, he couldn't keep quiet about it. Mr. Josser was a man who enjoyed a good game of cards, but in particular he liked the lighter side of it. At this very moment he was going through a cheerful little pantomime, first of all pretending that he hadn't got any trumps at all, and then his hand was suddenly full of them. Of course, she must have deserved it to get it. The magistrates aren't monsters. That was in Mrs. Vizard's voice again. 14 days is a very long time, Mrs. Boone. It's quite long enough for me, with my good name to think of, Mrs. Vizard. But if we're prepared to overlook it, Mrs. Josser. The rest of the sentence was entirely lost because Mr. Josser, finding that his pipe wasn't drawing properly, had removed the mouthpiece and was blowing noisily into the stem. Then there's more than ourselves to consider. There's the reputation of this house, Mrs. Vizard. Then Percy cut in. Have another fag, Miss Smythe? He asked. He was holding out his cigarette case. It was one of those neat little toys in which the cigarette comes popping up like a jack-in-the-box when the lid is slid off. Thanks, she said, and thrust it into the holder that had overwhelmed him earlier. Percy turned to Doris. It's no use offering you one, is it? He asked. Doris shook her head. Why not? Doreen asked. She smokes. At least she does in the office. Do you, Doris? Mrs. Josser had abruptly disengaged herself from the whisperers and was addressing... Oh, do you, Doris? Mrs. Josser had abruptly disengaged herself from the whispering and was addressing her daughter directly. Everybody stopped everything for a moment. Sometimes, Doris answered, uncomfortably. Well, please don't do it here, Mrs. Josser told her. If you get that sort at the office, that's your affair. It's different in your own home. Doris didn't say anything, but she was angry. She felt herself blushing. Thank you, Percy, I think I will, she said. He whipped out his cigarette case again, and the cigarette came bobbing up as briskly as before. Then he produced the lighter that Mrs. Boone had given him as a Christmas present. It worked at the first flick, and Doris sat back defiantly trying to blow the smoke out of her nostrils. Well, said Mrs. Josser, and it was Mr. Josser who was the first to speak after that. What trumps, Percy? He asked. It's still hearts, Percy said. But his mind wasn't really in the game. It was on Doris and Doreen. For a start, it was pretty exciting sitting down with a girl like Doreen at all. He dreamt about her sort. She looked the kind that you saw in the pictures in the pictures in The Bystander. She had class, and a haughty voice, and long red nails that didn't look as though they'd ever touched a typewriter. She knew her way about all right. You could tell that. But what had really gone to his head was seeing Doris blush. He'd been imagining it as he came home tonight. It had been one of those things, and now that he'd seen it, there was something oddly arousing about it. To cover his confusion, he pulled up his trouser leg and began scratching his calf. The next couple of rounds passed off smoothly enough, except for Mrs. Josser taking Doreen's queen with her king. This was an awkward situation, but Mr. Josser managed to extract some fun from it. He gave his own hand a reproving slap and looked across to Doreen to see that she had appreciated the significance of it. Meanwhile, the whispering had begun again. When she comes, I will tell her, Mrs. Vizard was saying. It won't be pleasant, but it'll be better for all of us. But don't you think... Doreen missed this bit. Just for a bit, she was making fresh... Oh, sorry. Doreen missed this bit. Just for a bit, while she's making fresh arrangements. She's made her fresh arrangements as far as I am concerned. It's tomorrow Connie's coming out, isn't it? Oh, hang on. He throws a spanner in the works. It's tomorrow Connie's coming out, isn't it? Mr. Josser asked suddenly, making no pretence at not having been listening to what the ladies had been whispering about. I thought we might get things a little bit ready for her. It can't have been much fun coming home from... This is a private conversation we're having, Mrs. Josser told him tartly. Mrs. Vizard came up to see me. Oh, all right, Mr. Josser answered good-humouredly. You can tell me afterwards. It's like, yeah, they're not going to keep the secret. She's going to tell him anyway. They'd finished the game by now, and Mr. Josser sat looking at the clock. It was just on 10 o'clock, and he was waiting for it to strike. It was a good long chime at 10 when it came, and he enjoyed every moment of it. Then, when the last note had died away, he stacked the cards in front of him and addressed Mrs. Josser. What about a cup of tea, Mother? The suggestion was the signal for Doreen to start saying that she had to go. She'd had a perfectly marvellous time, she said, and she'd simply love to stop, but there was that awful journey. She spoke of the journey as though there would be a St. Bernard dog out looking for her before she'd finished it, but Mr. Josser wouldn't hear of it. Can't go without nothing, he said. Mother never forgive me if I let you. Doreen was saying at intervals that she would have to be going, but she saw that it was useless. Oh well, she was thinking, I'll just gulp a cup of tea and then I'll dash off. Heaven knows when I'll get back to Hampstead. She felt sorry for Doris, but also resentful. She felt that Doris ought to have warned her what kind of evening it was going to be. If Doris had said to her, Doreen, darling, I'd love to take you home, but I can't because everything's just too impossible, she would have understood. She would have forgiven her for that. But as it was, Doris had just made her ridiculous. It was really unthinkable that she would have been expected to spend an evening playing whist with people like Percy and Mr. Josser. Thank God it's nearly over, she told herself. Nearly over, but not quite. She was just searching in her handbag for the last cigarette when there was a strange scuffling noise on the stairs outside. It was the sort of noise that furniture removers might make when carrying something heavy round an awkward corner, and it was a swaying kind of scuffle. It died away completely for a moment, and then returned louder than before. There was the sound of someone coming down 2 stairs at once, probably backwards. Then there was a heavy thud, followed by a groan. Careful, a voice said. Mind her head. Mrs. Josser got up from the china cupboard and looked accusingly at Mr. Josser. What's going on out there? She asked. Mr. Josser put down his pipe on the table and got up. Better go and see, he said reluctantly. But he was too late. Mrs. Vizard had already risen. The good name of number 10, already sullied, was at stake. And in front of a stranger too. She was in no mood for trifling. It might be, she reflected, that others beside Connie would have asked... Oh, sorry. And in front of a stranger too. She was in no mood for trifling. It might be, she reflected, that others beside Connie would have been asked to leave. But she was quite unprepared for what happened. As she reached the door, it flew open and was swept back into the room by a sudden rush of bodies. She gave a little scream and retreated hurriedly behind the table. Doreen, who had thought that she was ready for anything by now, screamed too, and even Percy felt instinctively in his pocket for his knuckle-duster. But there was no need for it. It was only Mr. Puddy and Mr. Squales. Mr. Puddy, Mr. Squales, and another. The third figure, who was precariously supported between them, was still kicking out vigorously with her legs, and was only half the size of the others. She was a small elderly lady with dyed hair. It was Connie, come home. Come home before the welcome was ready for her. Lummy, said Mr. Puddy, trying to recover his balance. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded Mrs. Vizard. Mr. Squales passed his hand across his forehead, thrusting back the lock of lank hair that still hung there. "Perhaps I should explain that our friend here is not well. She came home unexpectedly, and this gentleman," he indicated Mr. Puddy, "found her on the stairs outside her room, crying." "They've assaulted me," Connie broke in. She said it very indistinctly, however. It was obvious that the poor old thing was quite upset. She swayed from side to side as she stood there. "Pounced on me, they did," she went on, "out of the dark, like tigers." Mrs. Josser was regarding her closely. "Sit down on one of those chairs," she said. "That is, if Miss Smythe wouldn't mind moving." Doreen obliged by moving as far away as possible, and it was then that she noticed the small elderly lady's hands were clasped together in front of her, almost as though she was holding a prayer book. Even the fact that she was supported underneath her armpits didn't make her hands separate. But when the two men, the fat puffy one and the dark aquiline one, like an actor, lifted her into the chair, something happened. The hands came apart for a moment, and for the second time that evening, Doreen screamed. Out of the clasped hands, a small yellow bird shot upwards and began flying wildly in circles around the glass chandeliers like a large saffron moth, while the little old lady struggled frantically to get at it. "Duke!" she was screaming. "Duke! Don't you know it's me? It's your mother!" The canary hit the chain that dangled from the chandelier, and Connie put her hand over her eyes. "He'll burn his wings! That little angel'll scorch himself!" She was sobbing. "It's suicide!" At the end of that farcical chapter, we come to chapter 12. Oh my God, what an evening that was. You couldn't make it up. Well, somebody did. Excuse me. A little sneeze there. There's a second one. An afternoon, Richard got back from a long walk around Clapham Woods. Oh, that's nice. They're sweet peas, very... whatever. Oops. Whose these days distinctive feels their knuckle dusters in their pockets? Yeah, oh yeah, I've still got my knuckle duster, I'm all right. Gosh, that's the sort of chapter that one needs to have read beforehand so you could get the energy into it, because it was just absolutely, what an amazing evening. And what an inventive mind to come up with that. Dear, oh dear. Poor old Connie. So she's out of prison. Percy came in to ask Doris out. Doris turned her down. He then fancies Doreen. Mrs. Joss is trying to have a conversation. Mrs. Vizard. And Mrs. Vizard is saying, right, Connie's sullied the reputation of the house because she's been in court and has spent 2 weeks in jail. And Connie's come back. Mr. Puddy and Mr. Squales have manhandled her down for whatever reason, because she was outside crying and they didn't know what to do with her. And Connie had her canary, and it's... Anyway, so that was the end of that scene. My goodness, how much fun is that? Chapter 12. Italy had invaded Albania, and Uncle Henry had been suspended. The two facts were connected, closely connected, and the unfortunate part was that Mr. Josser, innocent and unsuspecting, got wedged in between. At first, when he heard the news about Albania, he didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it, but the BBC newsreader said it calmly and confidently, as though he'd been keeping his eye on Albania for some time, and Mr. Josser supposed that he had to believe it. Then he got angry, very angry. It seemed that Mussolini really was what Uncle Henry had always said he was, and on a Good Friday too. That was really shocking. There was only one solution, but it was quite a sizable one when you came to reason it out. Mussolini had struck east and not west. That was the point. His ambition had carried him into the Balkans, and the Balkans were always at war about something. If it had been France, for instance, that Mussolini had attacked, then the fat would really have been in the fire. But the very fact that he hadn't done so had showed that he daren't. He'd gone, typically enough, for the other chap. And even if he got him down, Europe, or at least Mr. Josser's end of it, would still be all right. It meant writing a new speech, of course, because the PM, Mr. Plumcroft, was down at the moment with the quinsy. The quinsy was still intact and unslothed, and not so much as a word could be choked out of him. But Mr. Josser had intended in any case to begin by saying, "We are living in a page of history in the making." And if you are living in a page of history, a footnote or two on the way is probably inevitable. He'd spent a lot of time getting his facts right. He'd looked up Albania on the map and found it. And he checked the number of bayonets that Mussolini had behind him. The general outlook, he admitted, was certainly dark. Entirely dark, except for that one ray of light about striking eastwards. When he went along to the South London Parliament, he was deeply conscious of the fact that to do justice to a speech like this, someone in top flight, Mr. Whipple or a Mr. Beanman, was at least needed. The first person he met when he got outside was Uncle Henry, who thrust a piece of paper into his hand. Mr. Josser thanked him for it and then started to read. The paper said in large rouge capitals, the whole thing, really. The paper said in large rough capitals, not rouge, got my G's and things in the wrong place. The whole thing had been hurriedly roneoed. Oh yes, Roneo Vickers. Do you remember those? The old Spirit printer. Turbo Stream will remember Roneos. My goodness, that takes you back. Anyway, the whole thing had been hurriedly roneoed. "This is war. Get ready." That was what's written on the paper. And underneath it, there was a lot about sanctions and guarantees and hopeless isolationism. Mr. Josser folded it up and put it into his pocket to read afterwards. There was a full house tonight, and Mr. Josser led off straight away. He was speaking by 8:30. He could see Uncle Henry sitting on the front opposition bench just opposite, and he smiled nervously across him. But Uncle Henry was in no mood for smiling. He looked madder than ever tonight, Mr. Josser thought, and he was on his feet even more than usual. Had His Majesty's government already signified that they were going to the aid of Albania, and if not, what was the cause of the delay? Were arrangements being made for the intake of refugees? Where was the Navy? Mr. Josser tried to deal with the points one by one as they came up, but they were troublesome and distracting. He was tired by the time he came to his point about war in the Balkans not mattering as much as war in Western Europe. And he was just beginning to prove that the storm would blow over, as storms always do, when Uncle Henry leapt to his feet and began waving a bundle of his little pamphlets in Mr. Josser's face. "There are times," he began, "when blindness is not an affliction, it is a curse. And more than a curse, it is a sin. There on the wall before us is the writing, and we are so criminally blind that—" Here the speaker interrupted him. "I'm afraid the honourable member is attempting to make a speech," he said. "This is not what was intended. He may only ask a question." Uncle Henry paused, and then he turned towards the chair. Are you aware, he asked, that within the next few months, weeks possibly, we shall be fighting for our lives? The dead bodies of our young men will be... The speaker rapped sharply with his hammer. Now you are addressing questions to me, he told Uncle Henry. I cannot allow that either. A good background of vestry work had prepared the speaker for most awkward situations, and he was calm and unrattled, as Mr. Plumcroft was in the face of a crisis. But he wasn't prepared for Uncle Henry, nor was Mr. Josser. Suddenly, pointing full at him, Uncle Henry raised his voice until he was shouting. Mr. Speaker is a fool, he said, an ignorant, credulous fool. The speaker brought down his gravel as though he were cracking nuts. I cannot allow such language to be used, he said. It must be withdrawn before you can continue. Withdraw nothing, Uncle Henry shouted back. He's more of a fool. He's a murderer. If we enter this war unprepared, I have no alternative but to suspend you from the sittings of this House, the speaker said sternly, and stop pointing your finger at me. The House adjourned shortly afterwards, because by then feelings were running dangerously high on both sides. And Uncle Henry did not stay behind, as he usually did. Having stalked out of the chamber with his arms full of his alarmist pamphlets, he had apparently mounted immediately on his green bicycle and gone pedalling off home alone. That was a great pity, Mr. Josser thought, and a mistake. Breaking up a regularly weekly party was carrying your convictions a bit far. It was the worst of cranks, because they spoil things. I can't really remember. I don't know whether they showed that in the film that much. And I think this was like a little debating society. I mean, it's not obviously not really the Speaker, and it's not the Houses of Parliament. It's not really government, but I think it's a society that has its own mock, as far as I understand it in the book, because there's no way these are the real people. But as far as I understand it, they're like a little mock chamber of their own. And I don't know whether that sort of thing must have gone on. I presume it did in times. But how interesting. Is Roneo Vickers rhyming slang, David Ed? No, Roneo Vickers was a company. Vickers was one company and Roneo was another company. And I believe that they joined together. I remember when I was a printer, Roneo Vickers were this, and they supplied these old. I don't know if you were ever at school and had these printed things in like purple or blue ink, and it was spirit, and you'd get it on this very strange paper, glossy-ish paper that often curled, and it was. And you could, I don't know how the process worked because I never really worked with Roneo Vickers, but it was a drum thing, and you could write on the thing, and you would print it off on a sort of desk printer in these early days, before having to, not before, but instead of having to go to a litho, which was ink and water, and having plates made, and proper ink, this was some spirit-based printing thing, if I remember, and you would turn this handle and it would print out. So teachers very quickly could, and I remember at school it was used, so I guess in offices as well, but you could get these letters to take home with homework in. I remember we used to get them, and the teacher had obviously run off to the office, and yeah, they were nasty smelling, exactly. And as I say, I'm sure that Turbo must remember more about it than I do because he was in the print trade. But it was they were horrible things. But it was before photocopying, basically. The kids, you'd sniff the paper and all of that. It was all good fun. Right, we've probably just got time to do one next bit, if you're up for that. Young Percy was on his way to something pretty hot. It was, in fact, about the hottest thing he'd ever handled in town. That was why he was smoking faster than ever, and the cigarette stubs were scattered all around him on the floor of the compartment. It wasn't a smoking compartment, but what the hell? He was worried, wasn't he? Not that worried quite described it. He was excited and jittery. But something else as well. He was flattered. Flattered because he'd been picked out for the job. Somebody, he didn't know the man yet, must have asked, Do you know anyone big enough to fix a thing like this? And the answer had come slap out, Percy Boone. That was the advantage of having connections. Without them, he would have been missed. He'd have been passed over. People, particularly the big people, would never have heard of him. They would have gone elsewhere to get their jobs done for them. And what would have become of his percentage then? It'd been in Smoky Joe's that he'd first heard of this particular bit of business, and his friend, Jack Rufus, he had to thank for it. Apparently, a friend of Jack Rufus was the man of many and far-reaching friendships. They made a constantly changing zigzag pattern right across the population of London, was onto something good, just at the very moment when he couldn't avail himself of it. They, Jack Rufus had explained in the undertone which he conducted all his conversations, were watching him, and he couldn't move. He didn't say who they were, and he didn't have to say it. Percy understood without being told. They was just an impersonal, almost inhuman force, a hostile influence like fate, something that was forever interfering with easy living in a free country. Percy had been curious at first, flattered but curious, just because of a man of Jack Rufus's size had asked him, he wasn't going to give everything away at once. What do I get out of it? He had asked. And when Jack Rufus had told him, he had laughed. Chicken feed, he said contemptuously, turning down the corner of his mouth. Just chicken feed. The phrase and the facial expression were something that he had practised, and it was proof that all these years at the films hadn't been wasted. And Jack Rufus had just come up step by step as Percy knew he would, and by the time Percy and Jack Rufus had separated, the job was worth £50 to Percy. No, not 50, a cool 50. That was the word that Percy kept repeating to himself. A cool 50. Easy as walking off a plank, he kept telling himself. Easy as breathing. And a cool 50 at the end of it. It was the biggest single sum of money that he had ever earned, and it seemed to hold out the promise of even bigger and sweeter things. All I need is a bit of capital, then I can start on my own, he repeated over and over again. If I had 1,000 a year on the level, I'd be okay. I'd marry Doris, not some mucky blonde. The hot job was getting rid of a stolen car. In the ordinary way, it was easy. Austin's and Morris's changed hands like sixpences, but this was different. This was a Bentley coupe, and that was waiting to be delivered. And Bentley coupes were tricky cars to handle, too classy and ultra. They were almost as bad as Rolls. People noticed them. You couldn't leave a Bentley in a cheap lock-up somewhere until things cooled off a bit without people beginning to get talking. The insurance people were always after missing Bentleys like a pack of bloodhounds. Little private investigation agents in trilby hats and greasy raincoats went round garages and lock-ups, sniffing. In Percy's own circle of friends, there were 2 reliable men who had got into bad simply because they'd started fooling around with Bentleys instead of sticking to Austins and Morrises and Fords. But it was a cinch. This particular Bentley, Jack Rufus had assured him. The buyer was ready and waiting for it, and no questions asked. So long as he got the car and a pair of perfectly good number plates, he wasn't the suspicious sort. All that Percy had to do was to drive the car over from Brook Green to Kennington and get to work on it. If anyone said anything, he could say he was doing it for a customer. One of the great advantages of a lad like Percy was that he had such a nice open face, and the police hadn't got anything on him yet. All the same, when Percy saw the car, he thought twice about it. It wasn't just your ordinary Bentley. It was a Cambridge blue town coupe with one of them fancy bodies that looked as though they'd come out of the Lord Mayor's show. There was bassinet work down the sides and a pair of silver coach lamps with blue glass in them standing out in the little brackets. The radiator cap was fitted with a glass statuette of a dancing girl. Percy shook his head and sucked in his teeth. Too risky, he said. Got stopped before the next corner. Jack Rufus's friend's friend, the man who couldn't move because they were watching him, shrugged his shoulders. If Percy didn't want to do a bit of easy money, he said, then he wasn't going to help him. As a matter of fact, he'd been able to tell from the moment he saw him that Percy wasn't the right man for the job. He was too pansy altogether, too pansy and just a bit yellow. Percy didn't like that, so he compromised a little. He offered to take the Bentley away if he could put in a couple of hours' work on her in the lock-up beforehand. But that was exactly what Jack Rufus's friend's friend wouldn't hear of. He said that he wasn't going to have anyone fooling about with the Bentley while he was still on its premises. It had to be a clean job or nothing. Percy lit another cigarette. The old one was only half smoked, though, and he thought the matter over. It was silly to be in any doubt with a cool 50 just sitting there waiting for him, but they were watching him too. So far, he and they were strangers, and he wanted to keep it that way. But another thought was going through his mind all the time. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. It seemed like a challenge, something showing him which way his duty lay. He remembered the cool 50. He remembered the £1,000 capital that he needed, and he remembered Doris. "OK," he said. "I'll do it when it gets a bit darker. Have you got a chauffeur's hat anywhere?" The friend was able to fix him up with that all right. He ran a hire service on the side, and he had quite a collection for Percy to choose from. While he was trying them on, the friend told him that he knew all the time he'd do it. He said you couldn't be in this game for long without becoming a pretty good judge of character, and he'd known that Percy had known what Percy was worth as soon as he had clapped eyes on him. All the same, it made Percy sign a delivery chip for the Bentley before he took it away. For himself, he didn't mind, but there was more than him in it. It was the syndicate. And he couldn't, he explained, have Percy Boone or anyone else going off with a valuable car without signing for it first. It was about 5:30 when the doors of the lock-up were swung open and Percy, wearing a chauffeur's cap, drove out. Dusk had already come, but it would have needed more than dusk to kill the magnificence of that Bentley. In the twilight, the long pale blue bonnet glittered like a satin dancing slipper. He avoided the main roads as far as possible. They were sure to be hanging about on the main roads, and he didn't want to run into any of them. And, on the whole, he succeeded. It was only once that he got himself into a tight spot that he felt sweaty already to break. It was only once that he got himself into a tight spot and felt the sweat already to break out on his backbone. That was when he had to draw up in the traffic block, right alongside a policeman. There was a street lamp exactly overhead, and the Bentley seemed every moment to be growing longer and longer and shinier. It was sitting in the middle of a shiny-coloured supplement in the motoring paper. Percy didn't shift his eyes. He just sat there without moving, the motor running and one foot ready on the accelerator. He was all ready for a quick getaway. The policeman turned his head and inspected the radiator for a moment. Then he ran his gaze along the bonnet. He seemed interested in what he saw, very interested. He sauntered up in a suspiciously slow and casual kind of fashion. Percy just sat there without moving. He was sweating now. He could feel the drops forming. "Nice car you got there?" said the policeman. "It's okay," Percy answered. "What'll she do?" 90. "Keep it up?" "You bet." "Ever get a chance to let her out?" "Not often." The lights changed and Percy revved up a bit. He let the car slide forward without even saying good evening to the policeman. The policeman seemed harmless enough. He was evidently just a motoring enthusiast. He'd have been interested in any Bentley and not necessarily this particular one. All the same, Percy wished that he hadn't spoken to him. They could be at their worst when they were apparently being friendly. Just on the safe side, he kept glancing into the driving mirror to see if he was being followed. But there wasn't anyone. Absolutely no one. It was £50 for sweet Fanny Adams. He reached the garage and was just congratulating himself on having got there without being recognised when a voice hailed him. "Hello, Percy," it said. "I was wondering if I should see you." It was the blonde. She was standing right at the bottom of the ramp, just where he had to go down to second to go up the slope. Oh, I see, when he had to go down into second to go up the slope. He hadn't seen her until she'd stepped out into the glare of the floodlighting. "Hello," he said, without even turning his head to look at her. Just one more page and we'll get to the end of the chapter. He had to get rid of the blonde. She had looked like stopping. But he had to be cold with her, very cold. He'd frozen her out of the garage just by not speaking to her. She didn't know, but he was waterproof against blondes now. Because of Doris, the blonde could jump into the river for all he cared. And he'd been busy. If the previous owner of the Bentley had come in now, he wouldn't have recognised it. The headlamps and the pass light were off, and he'd removed the statuette of the dancing girl. He was standing there with it in his hand. "Look all right on the mantelpiece," he told himself. And then he remembered Doris. Give it to her as a present sometime, he decided. Make a little joke about it and give it to her as a present. But the practical side of him reasserted itself. Have to get a capital B to put on instead. He went on musingly. If the owner is looking for a glass dancing girl and he sees a capital B instead, where is he? He put in about another half hour's work on the car and then stepped back again and looked at it. The silver coach lamps were off by now, and he'd got the radio set out as well. Altogether, he was pretty pleased with what he had done. Spray it over in navy, he was thinking, and she'll be a different car. And pick her out something. Doesn't matter how bright, so long as it's different. Before he stopped for the night, he removed the floor rug from the well of the coupe. It seemed too good to leave there, and in any case all the fittings would have to be changed before the new owner took over. You wouldn't get anyone in his senses driving about with a lot of other people's stuff still in the back. In the end, he took both the rug and the glass dancing girl home with him. The glass dancing girl he put away in the drawer of his dressing room until later, but the rug he gave to his mother. Mrs. Boone was delighted. The sad expression left her face for a moment as she stroked the rich, deep pile. "Oh, Percy, You are good to me, she said. I don't know any other son. Snuffing, mother. He cut her short. And that is the end of the chapter. He has got involved with stealing cars, and not any old car, an amazing Bentley, and he knew what to do. Percy Boone. This is an outrage. What is going to happen? Silly boy, says Michael White. Yes, it's hotting up, ladies and gentlemen. It's hotting up. Nice to see Justine Jones and Ben Reeve, Edward Moulding, and Nigel Sadler. I think I saw there. Michael White, hello to all of you. So I haven't paid you much attention, but I wanted to get to the end of that sequence before the weekend. What is it? What is going to happen? What's it all about? What's it all about, Alfie? We'll have to tune in on Monday to find out. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I will see you on Monday for the next exciting episode. Another cliffhanger, indeedy weedy. In the meantime, there'll be the Vobes show this evening with the lovely Julia and myself, and that's at 8 o'clock. But otherwise, have a good weekend, and I will see you next week. Take care. Thanks for watching. Ta-ta for now. Bye-bye.